Bienvenue tout le monde dans bel webinaire ça, après-midi que nous avons organisé avec support campagne Campaign for Peace, Disarmament and Common Security. Comme introduction, pour nous faire une introduction, disons, nous allons commencer avec présentation panélistes. Et puis, nous avons deux panélistes. En fait, on a commencé avec ça et puis, on a bien poser des questions. On a bien 30 minutes pour nous poser des questions dans la fin de session. Nous avons comprendre Internet peut tomber et c'est une raison qui fait que moi, pas de temps commencer avec introduction. Donc, moi, prépare en anglais et puis interpréter nous par le traduit de anglais avec Haitian Creole. So, again, hello everyone. My name is Roland Joseph. I'm originally from Haiti and I have been in the United States for 10 years. As an independent researcher, I am actively engaged as a member of different organizations, including the Center for Global Non-Killing, the International Peace Bureau, and the Non-Killing Center for Leadership and Conflict Studies. Since the beginning of this year, I have decided to educate Haitian people, especially Haitians living in the United States of America, about the threats posed by the existence of nuclear weapons. In fact, before proceeding, I would like to thank the staff of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, CPDCS, particularly Dr. Joseph Gerson, for their invaluable support in making this groundbreaking webinar possible. So, to my knowledge, this is the first ever webinar aimed at educating Asian Americans on the urgent threat posed by nuclear weapons. I feel honored and fortunate to have Dr. Gerson, the president of CPDCS, and Suzanne Mursky, chair of the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group of Mass Peace Action, joining us tonight as committed panelists for this historical event. Their presence underscores the importance of global solidarity in our collective efforts to right the road of nuclear weapons. Speaking of solidarity, I would like to highlight two insightful articles on nuclear disarmament from my friend Lilian of the IKIDA Center for Peace, Learning and Dialogue a few weeks ago. In one of those articles, authored by Detsuko Ikeda and titled Building Global Solidarity Toward Nuclear Abolition, Ikeda emphasized if nuclear weapons epitomize the forces that would divide and destroy the world, they can only be overcome by the solidarity of ordinary citizens. This resonates deeply with my passion to cultivate such solidarity. We must educate people about the danger of nuclear weapons. My involvement in the movement to abolish nuclear weapons was sparked by attending events focusing on the threats posed by those weapons. For example, in May 2018, I had the opportunity of attending a peace conference hosted by the Peace and Justice Center of Vermont. During this event, two speakers, Dr. Timon Wallis and Vicky Alsen, gave a compelling presentation on the urgent need to eliminate nuclear weapons. The insightful approach to the threat posed by those weapons had a profound impact on me by inspiring me to be involved in the movement to abolish nuclear weapons. The same year, I had the opportunity again to attend another informative event at the Ikeda Center for Peace, Learning and Dialogue in Cambridge, here in Massachusetts. During this event, I was moved by a presentation from a group of young people showcasing the Ikeda Center student-led video project on nuclear abolition. Through this video, they captured the reaction of Bostonians to the risk associated with the existence of nuclear weapons. I'm sharing these experiences to highlight the importance of nuclear disarmament education. People cannot actively oppose something that they know little or nothing about. If we aspire to involve more people in the fight against the dangers of nuclear weapons, it is imperative to educate them about the danger posed by the existence of those nukes. Since the beginning of this year, I have taken the initiative of publishing articles in Haitian Creole regarding the dangers posed by nuclear weapons on the Book on News website and online Haitian newspaper. Encouraged by the positive feedback from the public, the editor-in-chief of the journal pushed me to continue publishing more articles on the subject. While it is true that Haiti is not a direct target of nuclear attacks, its geographic proximity to the United States of America, the second most powerful nuclear state in the world after Russia, cannot be overlooked. I strongly believe that in the event of a nuclear war involving the United States, all Caribbean nations would be significantly affected within minutes of the attack. More than 2 billion Haitians reside outside of Haiti, with a significant portion living in the United States of America, particularly in states such as Florida, New York, Massachusetts, Georgia, New Jersey, and Connecticut. They collectively send millions of dollars each year to support their families back home. However, in the event of a nuclear conflict involving the United States and another nuclear state, such as Russia, the survival of these Haitian diaspora communities would be uncertain. The devastation of such a conflict would likely prevent many of them from continuing to support their loved ones, as the business or the institutions for which their work could be destroyed afterward. There is no doubt that Haiti is currently facing other security challenges, with the control of 90% of the capital by armed gangs, who are tragically killing innocent people. This disastrous situation has led to a humanitarian crisis within the country. Therefore, any escalation of a nuclear conflict between states possessing nuclear weapons will worsen this already precarious situation. Additionally, it is crucial to recognize that more than half of Haiti's national budgets depend on support from the international community. However, in the aftermath of a nuclear war, international institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund that play a crucial role in helping Haiti in its poverty reduction efforts may face significant obstacles in sustaining their support. It's not because they don't want to, but because the damage will be so enormous that one might wonder if those institutions and even the people leading them will still exist. Also, the use of nuclear weapons in a conflict would pose significant challenges for a country like my country, mainly due to the extensive atmospheric disturbances resulting from the atomic explosion. This would accelerate climate change and heighten the likelihood of natural disasters. It would destroy the agricultural infrastructure, contaminating the soil and water. And even some believe that nuclear weapons will not be deployed in conflicts because of the principles of nuclear deterrence. However, it is crucial to recognize that the profound risk the world faces now of entering a nuclear war. Currently, many nuclear armed states are involved in conflict with nuclear weapon and non-nuclear weapon states. This heightened global tension is reflected in the bulletin of the atomic scientist doomsday clock, which indicate 90 seconds to midnight in 2024. Scientists have maintained the clock at this perilous point for various reasons, including looming threats of nuclear war and the climate change. So in the event of a nuclear war, the interconnectedness and interdependence of humanity make all of us vulnerable to annihilation. Aware of this common peril, it becomes imperative that we come together in collective efforts to mitigate and even eradicate the threats posed by the existence of nuclear weapons. Collaboration is fundamental as we work together to eliminate those weapons before they eliminate us. This webinar is crucial in that it will empower Haitian immigrants, including church leaders, academics, peace and human rights activists, youth leaders, and Haitian American political figures, among others, with the knowledge and tools essential to understanding the dangers posed by nuclear weapons. This is a significant milestone as an inaugural event for a Caribbean nation. And Dr. Gerson and his staff, including myself, are committed to exploring additional avenues to raise awareness in the Haitian community and other Latin America and Caribbean communities in the United States. We will foster a more informed and vigilant global society in pursuing global nuclear abolition. Thank you so much for your participation. So now let me introduce our first panelist, Dr. Joseph Gerson. Dr. Joseph Gerson is the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, which he is hosting this evening's webinar. He co-chairs the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy, served as the Vice President of the International Peace Bureau, and co-convener of the International Peace and Plant Network. He was involved in launching the nuclear freeze disarmament movement of the 1980s, and since then has worked with Japanese air-bomb survivors and those from other nations. He educates and organizes at local, national, and international levels for peace and disarmament. His books include With Hiroshima Eyes, Atomic War, Nuclear Blackmail, and Moral Imagination and Empire and the Bomb, How the US Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World. Dr. Joseph Gerson, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to move to a screen share here, assuming I can make it work. That's not it. Here we go. Okay, so I'll speak over this as we go in here. I want to begin by thanking Roland for organizing this, and I'm really impressed, by the commitments that he's shown over the years. I really value this opportunity to be engaging with Haitian Americans. We don't talk enough, and it's really a great opportunity. I do want to express my concern for the families of many of you, people who are close to you in Haiti, as people there are experiencing what the United Nations today called an apocalypse. And the need to address that is obviously urgent. Let me see if I can make this thing work now. I have to do it this way. Okay, so simply to say that at the moment, actually in the last couple of months, there's been increased attention to the dangers posed by nuclear weapons. On the one hand, President Putin and very senior, I think, Vice Minister Medvedev in Russia have repeatedly threatened the possible use of nuclear weapons over the course of the war in Ukraine. And there's a very real possibility that if they did resort to nuclear weapons, that it could not be contained to Central Europe and could become a global war. So deep concerns there. And then, as many of you will know, we've just had the film Oppenheimer about the man who directed the Manhattan Project, which developed the first nuclear weapon. And that's open dialogue and discussion around the world. Concerns about nuclear weapons go way back. And there have been opposition and campaigns for nuclear disarmament, really almost since the A-bombs were first dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Pictured here is Senji Yamaguchi, who I was privileged to know, a man basically roasted with 9,000 degrees temperature. He was so terribly burned that even despite surgeries, when children would see him, they would run. But he was remarkably courageous, and you can see actually holding a picture of what he looked like before his surgeries. But he helped to speak out and to launch a movement of A-bomb survivors, and thus basically the international movement against nuclear weapons. And this is a picture of him actually speaking at the United Nations. And we had here in the 1980s, at the time when the US and the Soviet Union were in a very intense and spiraling arms race, a US and international movement to halt that arms race. And you can see a picture here of some of the people who went to New York to call for a halt in the arms race, and we were more than 1 million people there. As Roland said, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists have set their doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight. Midnight being apocalypse and the end of civilization as we know it. This is the closest we've been to the danger of annihilation since the clock was first initiated in 1957. At the same time, we have an international movement led by both civil society, ordinary people like ourselves, and by concerned diplomats from a number of countries, principally the countries that do not have nuclear weapons. And over a period of a number of years, as I'll explain later, they negotiated a treaty called the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which now has over 60 countries belonging to it and is the strongest international force against nuclear weapons. These are tough pictures, but I want people to, I was actually looking for video of what a nuclear weapons blast looks like, but everyone I found was a little bit too long to use for this purpose. But as you can see, a single atom bomb on the right there totally destroyed Hiroshima in a matter of seconds. And I'll explain a little bit what happened with that in a minute. a situation where the living in many ways envy the dead. What you see on the left is a painting by one of the A-bomb survivors of what it was that he or she saw. People burned to a crisp, people with eyeballs hanging out, their intestines hanging out, dying by the tens of thousands. And the reality is that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki A-bombs were small weapons. There were two different bombs used. I think wanting to look at possibilities for the future. There was a uranium bomb used against Hiroshima and a plutonium bomb against Nagasaki. In Hiroshima, about 100,000 people died either immediately or within the first couple of months after the A-bombing. And people have continued to suffer and die from cancers from the fallout and other radiation diseases. And the other bomb was a plutonium bomb, and plutonium was later used for the hydrogen bombs as well. And what you see below that is a picture of the destroyed area in Nagasaki. That bomb was dropped off target. It missed its target, and it exploded over the largest cathedral, a Catholic cathedral in Asia. And again, tens of thousands of people died immediately, and others died over time. What happens with a atomic explosion is within a microsecond, I mean, much less than a second, you have an intense fireball at the point of the detonation. It has a temperature of millions of degrees. It's hotter than the sun. And obviously, anybody who is within the immediate area is basically vaporized. When you see photographs or images of the mushroom clouds that emerged after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki A-bombs, what you're seeing in there are the ashes, the cinders, the remains of human beings, of homes, of buildings, and either if they weren't vaporized, then they become ash and radioactive fallout. You have in that first second a second wave of radiation, and that radiation wave poisons everybody, depending on the size of the bomb that's used, either within a couple of miles or maybe within tens of miles. And they may die quickly as a result of that radiation, or they may die over a period of time as a function of cancers and other radiation diseases. Then, shortly after the radiation wave, there's an air blast of huge, I mean, it's difficult to describe. It's like the worst tornado you can imagine, destroying everything in its path, just knocking them down. A man I'll show you a picture of later. No, actually, the man I showed you, Seiji Yamaguchi, he was literally blown about 10 feet in the air and then fell down. And as he was basically unconscious or coming into consciousness, he could see two children being blown above him, forced, just like leaves in the wind, and they died. And then you have a still wider wave, which you see here, which is a heat wave. And that wave basically is fire. And so everybody within that wave, anything in that wave, is burned. Many people dying. One of the people that I met, a man who actually became a physicist, he was in Hiroshima, and he was with his mother at the time, and he was 6 years old. And the bomb blast hit. It just the blast wave destroyed their home, and then with the thermal wave, the fire began. His mother was pinned under a beam of the house, and then the fires came, and were beginning to lick at his house. This little 6-year-old boy did everything he could to free his mother from that beam, but he couldn't. He was too small, and his mother yelled at him that he had to run. He had to get away and to save his life, and that's when she died. And that's a story that many people unfortunately experienced. Now, just to be very blunt here, Susan and I are both white people. We've been engaged in this work, and many of the people involved in nuclear disarmament, at least in this country, are Caucasian. But the reality is that from early on, people of color, African Americans, and others have been deeply involved in working to eliminate nuclear weapons. As you can see here, Bayard Rustin, and he was the man who was the principal organizer of the March on Washington in 1963. There was a recent film about him. Was involved in leading people to protest the French A-bomb in Africa, joined there by Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. And Dr. Martin Luther King began his opposition as early as 1957, quite some time ago. There's a very good book, which is pictured here, called African Americans Against the Bomb. And if you're interested to go a bit more deeply into that, it's well worth reading. The most dangerous moment we've had in the nuclear era, now 75 years, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. I could go on for quite a while about it, but I won't do that to you. But simply to say that it was a totally unnecessary crisis, and people within the White House thought that the possibility that we would launch a nuclear attack was between 1/3 and 1/2, which is to say we came within 30 to 50% of losing humanity. It happened at a time when, in 1962, when the United States had an overwhelming advantage in terms of numbers of nuclear weapons over the Soviet Union, Russia. And Khrushchev, who was the head of the Soviet Union, thought that one way to equalize the balance of terror, and we need to understand these are weapons of terror, was to base nuclear weapons in Cuba. They were discovered. Kennedy launched a blockade, and we came to just an incredibly intense crisis. People would go to work or to school every day, not knowing if they would live throughout the day. And in the end, there was a diplomatic solution. But along the way, there were some miscalculations. We think that presidents or prime ministers have full control over their nuclear weapons. They don't. And in one case, a launch order was sent to U.S. nuclear weapons in Japan. Unfortunately, the officer disregarded that. But we came very, very close to ending life on Earth then. And many people think that the crisis we face now is equal to that. In the 1980s, in the course of the social movements that were demanding an end to the arms race, a number of scientists went to work modeling what would happen if there was a thermonuclear exchange, if the United States and Russia launched their hydrogen bombs. And I should underline here that a hydrogen bomb can be tens, even 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, which the devastation you saw. And what they found was that if you have a serious thermonuclear exchange, the fires would create smoke and ash that goes up into the atmosphere. It would block the rays of the sun. The earth would cool. It would be so cold that crops would fail, people would freeze, and life would end in nuclear winter. Almost maybe 95% of humanity would die, sometimes over a course of months. And we're looking at, I'm sure, hunger in Haiti in the middle of the crisis there, certainly in Gaza, but this would be on a worldwide basis. More recently, a group called Physicians for Social Responsibility employed several very senior climate scientists to look at what would happen if there were a smaller nuclear exchange, say an exchange of 50 to 100 nuclear weapons, something that could happen, I'm afraid, too easily in the contest between India and Pakistan, or perhaps it could come out of a confrontation over Ukraine. Again, what they find is that the smoke from the fires, I mean, initially you'd have millions of people killed, I mean, at the site of the bombings in much of the country. But then the smoke from the fires would go up into the atmosphere, would block the rays of the sun. And over the course of about a decade, 10 years, as crops fail across, especially the northern hemisphere, you would have up to 2 billion people dying. So there's no such thing as a small nuclear weapon. This is a list of the nuclear weapon states, the number of nuclear weapons that they had at the time this chart was made. The fact that Russia has more than the United States is insignificant. If you go down to 1,000 nuclear weapons on each side, that's enough to bring on nuclear winter and to be, as they say, bouncing the rubble. China has more recently built an arsenal of about 500 weapons, and it's increasing. It seems that the Chinese are aiming to build an arsenal of maybe 1,000 or 1,500 deployed nuclear weapons, wanting to be equal in their ability to terrorize the earth. And I'll explain why in a minute, as the United States and Russia. And, excuse me, the other nuclear weapon states here, can bring on the kind of destruction that I was describing before. I hate to be, talking about all these horrible things, but this is the reality. This is what the 21st century really is. This is a timeline on when the different nuclear weapon states got their nuclear weapons. The United States in 1945, and I'll say a little bit more about that. The Russians sought immediately to develop their own nuclear arsenal as a way to deter the United States from threatening or using its nuclear weapons against Russia. The United States helped Britain to get nuclear weapons in the early 1950s. France followed. The Chinese followed shortly thereafter. And at that time, actually, the Russians, even though they were enemies of the United States, consulted with the United States about the possibility of attacking China with nuclear weapons to prevent it from developing nuclear weapons. Israel got its nuclear weapons in 1974, probably earlier. The Israelis had been lured by the French and the British into invading Egypt in an effort for the colonial powers to retake the Suez Canal. And they were actually, the United States forced the Israelis, the British, and the French to pull back. And the French, feeling guilty, helped the Israelis develop their weapon as a sort of a booby prize. And then you see India, Pakistan, and North Korea. India got its nuclear weapons, so Pakistan wanted its, and now we have North Korea as well. And there may be about 20 states that have and this we're dealing with technology that's 75 years old. So it's not exactly rocket science. The trick is to have the uranium and the resources needed to build it, and the willingness to endure sanctions. The United States, Soviet Union have nuclear triads, which is to say delivery systems in 3 different ways. You can see here in the lower right-hand corner, bombs can be dropped from bombers, airplanes. We have nuclear weapons, missiles on submarines, more than enough to end human life on Earth. And then we have ground-based missiles, mostly in the Midwest here of the United States. The Russians have the same. Other nuclear arsenals for the other countries tend to be smaller. Contrary to what you see in this image, the United States is planning to spend $1.7 trillion, which is a number I can't really actually imagine, to replace its entire nuclear arsenal and the entire triad, to modernize it, upgrade it, and to have it basically to threaten the rest of the world for the remainder of the 21st century. And then, you know, excuse me, we live with the illusion that these things are under full control, but they're not. This book, Command and Control by Eric Schlosser, details a number of nuclear weapons accidents and miscalculations by the United States over the course of the nuclear era. And the, excuse me, the banner on the right, The Man Who Saved the World, is basically a promotional banner for a film about a Soviet colonel who saved humanity. There were a weather satellite had been launched from Sweden, I believe, and the Soviet technology was saying that the Soviets were under threat of a nuclear attack. It was his job to notify people in Moscow so that they could launch an attack before they lost all their missiles. And he thought maybe this just might be wrong. And so he refused, he failed to send that warning, the launch order. And as a result, both the Soviet weapons were not used in retaliation for what was an accident, a miscalculation. And he was demoted. He hadn't followed proper orders. So he saved humanity, but he lost his job and was demoted. So I worked very closely over a number of years with Daniel Ellsberg. Unfortunately, he's no longer alive and with us. Dan had the responsibility in the Kennedy administration to design the U.S. nuclear warfighting doctrine. One of the things he did was he had a memo sent by President Kennedy to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the senior generals, to ask how many people would be killed if the United States launched a nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. And the response came back on the order of about 400 million people in the Soviet Union and China, and some fallout in portions of Europe. And then he asked, well, what would happen if there was a attack that included China? And the number came back somewhere on the order of 700 million. This sort of turned Dan around and became one of the leading opponents of nuclear weapons. And one of the things he said, and I think this is really important to understand, is that nuclear weapons are used when, when an armed robber points a gun at your head. Whether or not the trigger is pulled, the gun has been used. And so on about 30 occasions or more during international crises and war, the United States has prepared and or threatened to initiate nuclear war, basically to prevent other countries to come to the aid of the people that we are determined to attack. And we'll go through that list in a little bit. Other countries have done it as well, but only many fewer times. Here's the list. So it's interesting. I mean, the Middle East with its oil has been a central focus of basically colonial ambitions, right? So after the British lost influence there, the United States moved in to control the oil, which also provided the United States a way to control much of Europe and Asia needing that oil. So during different crises, about 15 times actually, the United States has prepared and threatened to launch nuclear war to maintain its dominance in the Middle East. Most recently, during the two Iraq wars. We can go into in greater detail in Q&A if you want. At least 5 times in relationship to North Korea, 4 times during the Vietnam War, several times against China, Cuba, even Guatemala. And as you see on that was during the coup in Guatemala that the CIA organized. And then you'll see on the right the years in which other nations threatened nuclear war. And it's all detailed in my books, and Dan Ellsberg wrote a book which contains much of this as well. Going a little bit into the history, and I don't want to go too long here, but in 1938, two German scientists discovered nuclear fission. Otto Hahn initially found it, but he didn't understand it. And he wrote to Lise Meitner, a Jewish scientist who had to flee Hitler's Germany, and she was the one who figured out what was going on. And scientists immediately, began, within the field of physicists, they began trying to understand what was going on. In 1939, you have here a picture of Hitler and Mussolini. On the left, on the right, you have Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, two physicists. The fear in the United States was that what Einstein warned was that Germany might try to get a nuclear weapon, and that they could then use it to intimidate or attack any other country and basically dominate the world. So they wrote a letter to President Roosevelt suggesting that the United States needed to develop its own nuclear weapon in order to deter the Germans from using nuclear weapons. That led to the Manhattan Project. And if you look at the film on Oppenheimer, you see how the Los Alamos was built to build the bomb. Picture on the right is Joseph Rotblat. He was the one senior scientist in the Manhattan Project who resigned over moral considerations. And in fact, in 1942, after the United States had learned that Germany would not be able to make a bomb in time for the war, Rotblat got to Los Alamos at that point. And in speaking with General Groves, who ran the whole project, Groves told him that the bomb was no longer about Germany. It wasn't even about Japan. The bomb was about Russia. And we'll come to that in a minute. In fact, we'll come to it right now. So just before the first nuclear weapons test in July 1945, Truman wrote that if it explodes, as I think it will, I'll certainly have a hammer over those boys, over the Russian leaders, over Stalin and the Russian leaders. And the war, as you see here, next slide, Admiral Leahy was the chief of staff in the White House. You don't get much more powerful than that unless you're president. And he was also the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the senior military officer during the end of the war. And before the atomic bombings, he wrote to Truman that a surrender of Japan can be arranged on terms acceptable to the United States. And he later wrote in 1950 that the use of the nuclear weapon was of no material use in the war against Japan. The Japanese were already essentially defeated and ready to surrender. The reason the atom bombs were used, there were several political reasons, but the primary reason was that the Russians were about to come into the war. They declared war on August the 8th, 2 days after the Hiroshima bomb and the day before the Nagasaki bomb. And the concern was that the Soviets would gain influence in northern China, in Manchuria, and in Korea. The United States would lose influence there. And so to bring the war to an immediate end, the atomic bombs were used. I'm going to try to move a little bit quickly here because it's getting late, and I don't want to take too much time. Edward Teller was the father of the hydrogen bomb, and that was developed, what, in 1949, and they began tests in the Marshall Islands. Many years ago, in an interview with Yasser Arafat, he said that in the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, it's cowboys and Indians all over again. And similarly, Marshall Islands, and particularly the Bikini Atoll, and the people living around it, were basically exterminated or used as guinea pigs in nuclear weapons tests. The book on the right is one actually that I edited. written by a man who was a fisherman on a ship when the U.S. detonated a bomb 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima A bomb. It killed many people on the nearby Rongelap atoll. It poisoned about 1,000 Japanese tuna fishing boats and much of the Japanese food supply. And in fact, that was what initiated, in response, the Japanese peace movement. There's a new Godzilla movie out now. What most people don't know is that the first Godzilla film was made in Japan, not as a love story, which the U.S. version of it looks like, but as a response to the Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Bikini H bombs. The idea is that the Bikini H bomb did something to the ocean that released Godzilla, and then he wreaked his terror on Japan. And in the original version, you see what was needed to the kind of sacrifice, the kind of commitment needed to eliminate nuclear weapons. There was a world conference held. I'm sorry, out of that, there was also a petition campaign in Japan that garnered 31.5 million signatures calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. It led to the, I'm going to jump around here. It led to the first World Conference against A&H bombs. People from around the world came to it, and you see a more recent version of that. It's held every year. And that in turn opened the way for A-bomb survivors who had been hiding for about 10 years to come forward. And it took just incredible courage for them to speak out. They had, their wounds were terrible, as you can see on the right. The man on the right was 4 years in the hospital. His wounds never really fully healed. And there were fears that there wasn't much known about nuclear weapons at the time, and the United States, with a military dictatorship in Japan, kept people from learning about it. And so not until 10 years later did people, and there's also fears that people didn't know what it was. So they thought, well, maybe the radiation was contagious. People were deeply concerned about, didn't want their children to marry A-bomb survivors because there might be mutations of their children and so on. And these people came out, told their stories, and in many ways opened up the international debate for abolition of nuclear weapons. That one very wise magazine editor here in the United States brought a number of young women, Hiroshima maidens, who've been disfigured for plastic surgery, and that also served as a way to educate Americans about the situation. And as the note here on the right, this is actually a headline from The Guardian newspaper. The madness continues. Here is Congressman Tim Walberg, who's a member of Congress right now, saying that the Israelis should use the A-bomb like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the idea of fighting nuclear war still is really quite real. But as early as 1945 and 46, right after the Hiroshima A bombing, you had religious leaders who were horrified by the bombing, sending telegrams to Truman saying, get rid of these things. You had the precursor to the National Council of Churches calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And you had signers on these things, including Reinhold Niebuhr, who was one of the most important theologians here in the United States in the 20th century. As I mentioned before, Martin Luther King was a fierce opponent of nuclear weapons. And as he said, every man, woman, and child lives not knowing if they shall see tomorrow's sunrise. And he asked, what's the point of having social justice here if we're all going to be eliminated anyhow? So the importance of working for nuclear weapons abolition. Here in Boston in 1983, we had really quite a remarkable and successful campaign. President Reagan and Senator Kennedy wanted to turn Boston Harbor into a nuclear weapons base just across from a runway at Logan Airport. And a number of us knew how this was going to increase the nuclear confrontation. We were aware of the Navy's history of nuclear weapons accidents, and there was the danger of something happening from the airport. So we organized a campaign which succeeded. Among other things, there was a mayoral election happening that year, and we approached a number of the mayoral candidates, including Mel King. And Mel King certainly is one of the great civil rights heroes of Boston, and just the anniversary of his death just this month. And Mel took it on to oppose the creation of the harbor and played a very important role in defeating it. What you have here, there were over about the last, almost a decade, a series of international conferences, diplomats, on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, designed to educate the diplomats about how dangerous nuclear weapons were. And the A-bomb survivors, and they're not only A-bomb survivors from Japan, but we have downwinders here in the United States. We have atomic veterans who were exposed to nuclear weapons as guinea pigs, and other countries that have nuclear weapons, created nuclear weapons victims. And they testified at these sessions. The International Red Cross testified, and so on. I was at one of them where after the presentations, a young diplomat, I believe from Zimbabwe, got up and he's raising his arms and he's saying, "What are these people thinking? How crazy are they?" And that in turn led to the negotiation of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which I mentioned before. On the right, what you see here is Setsuko Thurlow, one of the absolutely most courageous, outspoken of the A-bomb survivors in Japan, who spoke at the third conference. And with her is the then Prime Minister of Austria. The session was held in Austria. So you can see kind of some of the powers that be that were involved. And I think I've got two more pictures here to go. Yeah, the one on the left, if you will, the mother and father of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, Elaine White Gomez from Costa Rica, and Ambassador Kemet from Austria. And on the right, last year, they had the second meeting of states parties to the treaty with a number of side events. And what you see here are nuclear weapons victims from Japan, from New Mexico, and from the Marshall Islands, along with the Austrian ambassador to the conference. And then just to conclude, and Susan will build on this, one of the most important initiatives now to work for disarmament is called the Back from the Brink campaign, with congressional resolution HR 77 that has 43 members of Congress who are supporting it. And as you'll see, it calls for renouncing the doctrine of first strike nuclear weapons, ending the president's ability to launch nuclear weapons on his own, taking nuclear weapons off of hair trigger alert. We can explain what that is. Canceling the plan, that $1.7 trillion plan to replace the arsenal and its delivery systems, and then negotiating, as we're required to do under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to move to hosting and leading international negotiations for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. We are treaty bound to be eliminating our nuclear weapons. So with that, sorry I went a little bit long, and happy to give the chair back to Roland.
Wow, très belle présentation. Merci en pile, Dr. Gerson. En pile information pour participants après-midi. Nous vraiment édifiés. Et c'est ça qui est important pour nous partager informations sur question armes nucléaires et faire ça que nous sommes capables de faire dans le monde là. Et nous tous, nous interconnectés, nous interdépendants, et quel que soit côté utiliser les n'a senti effet. Donc, comme nous le a marché en pile, nous allons introduire prochaine intervenante là qui c'est and Suzanne Mirsky. Suzanne Mirsky is a chair of the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group and Massachusetts Peace Action Legislative Coordinator for CD4. She has been a founding member of Newton Dialogues on Peace and War since its beginning in 2001. In high school in 1959, she helped organize the Youth Committee on Safe Nuclear Policy in Essex County, NJ. And college she helped organize a student group against the Vietnam War. She was instrumental in advocating for the city of Newton to have a citywide municipal election on nuclear issues. She also organized city council to pass a resolution on the dangers of the Boston University Homeland Security BK4 biolab. She had worked steadily in Newton, and Massachusetts to publicly discuss the risks associated with the existence of nuclear weapons and the money being drained for the production of resources needed to support our people and planet funding common concern. She's particularly interested in helping young people become engaged in these issues. Non pa gen vreman anpil tan nan rest prezentasyon, nap just ale tre rapide pou nou kabay publik la au moins 20 minutes, 15 minutes pou ta pose question pendant session. Mrs. Suzanne, you have the floor now.
Hi, well, hello to all of you there listening. And thank you, Roland. I mean, you really set the stage for the importance of being aware of nuclear weapons and nuclear threat in a very direct way. You know, what got you going, what your interest was. And Joseph, you know, as always, you really laid out almost every aspect of the history and the dynamics of nuclear war, nuclear weapons. So thank you both. You know, I just want to say hello. And taking off from what both of you have said, you know, I want to add the amount of money. You know, Joseph, you alluded to this, the incredible amount of money that is being spent on upgrading nuclear weapons and on making new weapons. Money that should be spent for all of the issues that we know are so important, like housing and education and healthcare. So many issues. And it's not happening. It's not happening because of the vast amounts of money spent on military budget. You know, even at this moment, we're looking to spend money making more rockets going out from the Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. This is U.S. Space Force, known as SpaceX. So these are possible nuclear-armed weapons or rockets. We know that new weapons, more weapons, increases the chance of their being used by intent or by accident. And Joseph, you talked about that. We also, you know, today is the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And Joseph, you alluded to that also. But something that Martin Luther King said was, a nation, and there's a quote, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Now, he said that in 1957. He said that a long time ago. And it's increasing, and certainly we are. There's a program called National Priorities Project, which talks about the amount of money that is being spent on nuclear, on military, and what portion of that, what that could be used for human needs. And you can look that up, the National Priorities Project. It will also let you know how much your city or town is spending, how much money is going towards the military budget. I also want to point out something that you've alluded to, is that traditionally the testing, the mining, plutonium mining, all of it is so much more impacted on both people of color and poor people, both in this country and elsewhere. And it's so unjust, and it's inhumane, and the possibility of nuclear war is so horrific. So we call it an existential threat. And that's something that is of interest to me. So, like, how do we talk with people about this? How do we wrap our heads around the possibility of these weapons being used either by intent or by accident? How do we talk with our family, with our friends, and with young people? How do we talk with them in a way that can engage them rather than have it be overwhelmingly terrible? So I would really like to hear from you, and perhaps in the Q&A, if any of you out there have any ideas about how to engage, how to talk with people about this. In Mass Peace Action, on the Nuclear Disarmament Working Group, we deal with all things that have to do with nuclear weapons. Right now, we're going to be looking at the ICBMs, which is one leg of the triad, nuclear triad, because it's dangerous and it's wasteful. And it's the weakest link, and we have the greatest possibility for some success. But we look at bills, both national, on the state level, and also what we can do in our cities and towns. So we look at all levels of interaction and how we can engage with people. We look at the money that's spent. We look at the corporations that thrive and make money out of nuclear weapons. They're the ones who are making money that it should be used for us, for our purposes. So I'm going to make it really brief, and I think end there, or end here, because I really want to hear from you about your ideas. So thank you.
Wow. Merci. Suzanne, pour belle présentation ça. Donc, il pose un problème de violence structurelle dans le sens injustice que Zamsa lui posait. et l'argent qui a utilisé pour développer les armes, ça est capable justement aider développer une sorte de solidarité dans le monde là, dans le pays tant que pays caribéen, pays latino et puis pays africains. Donc, merci un peu pour la présentation ça. Et puis, nous avons vraiment aimé Jean-Suzanne Dili, tendez public là, audience là, sur questions, commentaires que vous avez pour deux panélistes, nous, disons pour nous tous les trois, si vous voulez, par rapport avec bel webinaire ça après-midi que nous faisons pour Haïtiens américains ou bien immigrants qui vivent bon, ici aux États-Unis et non déterminés. Et nous pensons que l'important, question d'armes nucléaires pour tout le monde comprendre qui ça qui est, qui conséquences li, et le fait qu'il existe parmi nous-mêmes êtres humains. Donc, est-ce que vous avez une première question? Aidez-moi à garder, s'il vous plaît. Si vous avez une première question, qu'on est capable de prendre. C'est mon premier monde qui voulait poser question. Moi, ouais. OK, moi, Q&A. OK. Again, Janet Simon qui dit, I do not have a question or an answer. Whenever I bring this up with family and friends, they quickly change the subject. I think they are both uncomfortable and uninterested. Exactement. Donc, si par exemple, l'autre monde qui a posé question, qui a posé une question même pour nous continuer avec le débat. En fait, dans un moment de question avec Suzanne, qui gens yo même yo ouais mouvement pour abolir les armes nucléaires dans les pays sous-développés, disons, pays tant que pays africains, pays caribéens, qui genre nous ouais mouvement ça? Est-ce que nous pensons qu'est-ce qui ça capable faire en fait pour nous capables porter plus jeunes dans la zone ça conscient de problèmes même si ils n'ont pas possédé des armes nucléaires la caillou?
I'll jump in first, and then Susan, please. I want to answer kind of on two levels. First of all, yeah, how do you begin to communicate with your neighbors, with your family? I think one thing to do is simply to find ways to become active in ways that are perceived to be safe and meaningful. So, for example, here in Watertown, where I live, people are circulating a petition urging the city council to adopt a resolution in support of HR 77, in support of nuclear disarmament, back from the Brink campaign. And by asking a signature, you're not doing a whole lot more than just saying, look, there's a problem here. Can you help us make it possible for us to debate this and to try to make it policy? Non-threatening, a simple act that people can do. And my experience is that when people even take a small step, that then kind of breaks the hesitance, the fear, the unknown, and provides a way forward. So here in time, I expect there'll be discussions at the city council. People will encourage people to go, and so on. One thing is simply to read books together with your friends. I mean, there's book groups. There's a fair number of books that can be read, or articles that can be the basis of discussion. Going to Roland's question about people of the global South and how to impact. As I was concluding my talk before, I made reference to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is the most profound and important of the nuclear treaties. And it reflected a basic deal between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. The nuclear weapon states committed to engage in good faith negotiations for the complete elimination of their nuclear arsenals. And in exchange, the non-nuclear weapon states committed never to get nuclear weapons. And in a flaw in the treaty, they were given the right to develop nuclear power for generation. And over the years, the nuclear powers have refused to implement their part of the treaty. They just resist it. And this is what led countries from the global south, from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, to come together in those humanitarian consequences conferences, one of which was held in Mexico, and led to the negotiation of the treaty. Interestingly, it was Elaine White Gomez who led the diplomats at the UN to negotiate the treaty. And so what you see is they're using that treaty to, on the one hand, exercise reflect their disgust with the nuclear powers, but also to use that as a lever to try to press the nuclear weapon states to do what they should. So that's my quick and dirty.
Okay, so I just want to add, sometimes, when we think people are not interested, it may very well be, it just feels too much for them. They have no ability to do anything about it, and it's too big a problem. So sometimes what we can do is, aside from the things that Joseph has talked about, we can call the mayor of our city and say, for our future, for our children, for our grandchildren, we want a world for them that is safe and secure. And nuclear weapons are an avenue of death and destruction. And we want a future for our kids. And that, do whatever you can do. You can go to the within Massachusetts, there is a bill in front of the State House that is a commission bill, which deals both with nuclear weapons and things that having to do with nuclear weapons in the state, and also climate, brings in climate crisis. And you can go to your state representative and say, yeah, I want you to do something that will keep my children, my grandchildren safe from nuclear weapons. And I don't think that these corporations that make all this money, that are making these weapons, are good for me, are good for my family. So there can be discussions, just a simple call, or even talking with a neighbor about the future and what is scary for them. Although I do have to admit, we talk about nuclear war as being an existential threat, and I do recognize that sometimes when you're talking with people who are who have no money and who have real significant healthcare issues, those those people, that is in some ways an existential threat. And so to go from what is really most important in times of personal crisis, and we have to understand that so many people are living like that, to go to this other plane of nuclear weapons and nuclear war is doable. But I think if you talk about it, and Roland, you talked about it personally. So if you talk about it personally, what is important to you, that helps.
Just to say real quickly, I'm putting into the chat here, the use of films are great. You can watch them at home. And there's also a wonderful series, a comic book series actually, called Barefoot Gen, about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki A-bombing and their consequences. But it's accessible for young people. and a really great resource.
Yeah. There's also a short video on is it how to nuke or what if we nuke a city? And although it's with an English accent, um, it's effective. Right. The only survivors of a nuclear war, we say, are cockroaches, and we want to live.
Okay, we have a few questions in the Q&A. Anoi Tanabe asked, thank you very much for this illuminating and timely discussion. One massive challenge with nuclear weapons is the false narrative of deterrence. Do you have any suggestions for how to engage with deterrence advocates on the realities of the nuclear threat?
So two things here. The rationale that most nuclear weapon states have for their nuclear arsenals is that they're there to deter their enemies. The Soviets got theirs to deter the United States. Pakistan got theirs to deter India. India got its to deter China, and so on. Two things about this. First of all, deterrence works until it doesn't work. Accidents, miscalculations, even subordination among soldiers can lead to the launching of nuclear weapons and the end of deterrence, miscalculation. So you have that. The other piece there is that we assume that our nuclear arsenals are there for deterrence. But if you look at how they have been used over and over again in crises and wars, you see that certainly the United States, Russia, Israel, North Korea have first strike doctrines. It's not about deterrence. It's a threat to initiate nuclear war. So I think one of the things we have to do is to help people understand that deterrence often is not what the policy is. I mean, China is the one country that does not have a first strike doctrine. In terms of alternatives, right, how you get off of it, I made reference in my talk to the massive movements of the early 1980s. And one of the things that those movements did was they led the Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, to bring together senior figures from the United States, from the Soviet Union, and from Europe to try to figure out how they could end the spiral with, when one country felt a little bit threatened by its rival, then it would get new nuclear weapons that would bring fear in the rival, so they would make nuclear weapons and you spiral on up. And the question was, how can you end that spiral and build down? And they came up with a concept called common security. The idea that you cannot get security on your own, but only in coordination and cooperation with your rival. And so that process, negotiating, led to the negotiation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in Europe, which basically halted the arms race and ended actually the Cold War before the Berlin Wall fell. And there are new initiatives now in Europe, and I'm working with people across Asia and the Pacific to kind of revitalize the concept of common security and to come to some very concrete proposals. Final thing to say is that maybe goes more back to the earlier question. Especially in the global South, many countries have come together and created nuclear weapons free zones, saying that they won't get nuclear weapons and that other countries can't have nuclear weapons in their region. So you have an African nuclear weapons free zone. You have a Latin America free zone, you have a Southeast Asia free zone, and these are important initiatives that kind of move beyond deterrence and into the kind of common security that we need to survive.
Yeah, parce que nuclear weapon free zone est vraiment important dans motiver ou bien dans conscientiser plus moun nan monde là. Et une nuclear weapon free zone, c'est Latin America. Et m'kwe Haïti signé accord ça, et m'kwe Cuba fait le tour finalement. Donc, c'est un gros pas vers l'élimination, mais l'abolition d'armes nucléaires. Nous avons une autre question. C'est Gabriel. Gabriel my question is, why USA and Russia block the nuclear agreement treaties if they know how dangerous nuclear weapons are?
Susan, do you want to take it?
Money, corporations that make them, that make these weapons, that sort of buy and sell, and their involvement with the people who are in power, who run our government. But I will hand it over to you, Joseph.
So just two other ways to look at it. If you look at the war in Ukraine, the Russians threaten nuclear attack if NATO, if the possibility of NATO coming in, or if the Ukrainians threaten to take over Crimea. So basically a weapon of terror, and holding on to that first strike doctrine. The idea of creating, if you will, recreating a Russian empire. Of course, the United States has done it over and over again, as I said before, in order to maintain or expand its empire. So there's this illusion that somehow, basically it's a big gamble. It's a gamble that we can possess these, we can threaten their use, and we will not end in human life. But as we learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis, among others, it can get extremely dangerous. The other thing just to be aware of, there's the expectation or hope that leaders who have their fingers on the nuclear button are rational. But they're also human. Humans are not entirely rational. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were uncertain whether we were going to survive it, there were powerful political forces, right-wing forces in this country, that led Kennedy to create the blockade, to increase the level of the confrontation. And President Kennedy said to his brother Robert, if we hadn't done the blockade, if we hadn't responded as we have, I would have been impeached. So in order to avoid being impeached, he was willing to threaten human existence. And we can be sure that there are similar kinds of political pressures in China on Putin and so on. So it's one of the things that's really quite, I find remarkable, is the potential power of individuals and the law of unintended consequences, that we can take an action and it may, if they say, spark a prairie fire. So it was a woman at MIT, a graduate student, who had the idea of a nuclear weapons freeze in 1979. That led to more than 300 towns and cities across New England voting for a nuclear weapons freeze, 8 states voting for it, sparked that demonstration of 1 million people, and forced President Reagan to have to begin negotiating with Gorbachev for nuclear disarmament. So I think none of us can ever know exactly what action we take, what its consequences were going to be. But just taking simple actions, talking with your friends, trying to figure out what it is we can do where we live, can lead to some interesting results.
That's very positive. Now to go swing over to the negative. So we have somebody in our group who talks about nuclear weapons, nuclear war, and he says it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, because of uh, both the human error, the human aspect to it, and also the possible of accidents, the possibility of accidents. Also, as these weapons get faster and as there are more, the likelihood of, there just being one exchange after another, of it just going. I watched Dr. Strangelove
Mhm.
a while ago, and I was horrified by the end. Although there's some comedy, funny parts of it, there's an element of just, like an error, and there it goes. So, Joseph, I like your very positive thought about we can do this, we can talk, and we can do this. We
But
can
just one other thing to say is that, the idea is it's over there. I mean, the reality is that we have more than 1 million people in this country who have been poisoned by fallout, by working on nuclear weapons. There's nothing more powerful than a human story and a human face. So that there are a number of these people. I made reference to the Trinity A bomb, right? When the Trinity A bomb was exploded, they weren't thinking about the Native Americans who lived across New Mexico, and others in New Mexico who were poisoned by it. And now that poison goes into the next generation. Well, there are people in the downwinders, the atomic veterans, who've been pressing Congress, telling their stories, trying to get at least some medical care that they need. And it's not impossible to invite these people to speak in a small webinar, or even have them come to the community and talk. And that's a way to build engagement and build the kind of commitment that we need.
Yeah, in fact, we did just have a webinar about that.
Mhm,
It was sort of what Oppenheimer left out.
mhm.
And we had three fascinating and very involved uh, women from different parts of Southwest New Mexico. And now there is a movie that has come out, and hopefully it will come to theaters as after it goes through uh, these film festivals, called First We Bombed New Mexico.
Mhm.
So keep a lookout for that, and for these people who are telling their stories. And the you can, when you talk with your state representatives, you talk with your Congress people, talk with them about the RECA, about RECA, and it's RECA, and the importance of supporting RECA.
Merci. Nous gagnons l'autre question, mais nous pas capable de prendre plus de questions encore parce que il est en 7h34. Nous t'ai planifié pour nous finir à 7h30. Nous t'ai commencé exactement à 6h. Et puis 7h30 là, c'est là pour nous finir. Mais nous allons demander, nous allons chaque parler des peut-être une 30 secondes pour conclure. Mais comme il y a un monde qui pose une question, je ne sais pas si a tout conclu avec ça comme réponse. Mais entre-temps, quittez-moi remercier deux panélistes, tout staff, organisation ça, et puis qui travaille avec Dr. Joseph Gerson. Moi, vraiment, pas de mots pour moi remercier nous pour bel webinaire ça, pour bel séminaire ça que nous faisons après-midi, pour la communauté haïtienne, non, nous pensons que c'est pas une dernière fois nous rencontrer, nous avons fait l'autre session justement pour nous capables de mobiliser la communauté haïtienne. Non. Et pourquoi pas l'autre communauté dans Caraïbes, Latine-Amérique qui vivent aux États-Unis et Massachusetts pour nous capables de sensibiliser devant un gros phénomène ça. Donc, Jean Suzanne mentionné déjà, un pile l'argent dépensé, mais pourquoi? Pour qui ça tout comme ça a dépensé pour développer une arme qui pas même utilisée et depuis Hiroshima que ça avec Nagasaki ça a été fait, mon projet jamais fait encore. Donc, d'autres qui sont obligés à développer dépasser de gaspiller tout comme ça pour développer une arme que nous pas jamais utiliser. Voilà, donc merci en pile tout le monde qui a participé dans le webinaire ça. N'a juste quitté panéliste conclu dans 1 minute ou bien 30 secondes. Et puis, si vous avez qu'à nous toi, pour répondre aux questions, participants ça, qui c'est Carnegie Louis, qui dit what the next step to stop or reduce the threat of nuclear war or power. Merci tout le monde. C'est la dernière phase webinaire là.
So what I saw for the last question was what's the next step? And I want to suggest 2 next steps. So one is, as Roland said in the beginning, he's committed to furthering this work in the Haitian community, Haitian American community. And I would encourage people to look for what he puts up next and ways that you can engage and come together. The other thought that I have is that the Massachusetts Peace Action Nuclear Disarmament Working Group is always welcoming new people to join. And people who are interested could sign in. Roland can send out the contact information to everybody. And just if you're curious, you can listen into the discussions. You don't have to feel like you've got to jump in with both feet, but you should feel yourself welcome to that working group. And the last thing I'll say here is when I was getting ready to graduate from college, I went with a friend and a professor. We went to New York, and the friend was anxious about what was going to happen after he graduated from college. And would he be able to continue being an activist? Would he be able to continue to live out his values? And the professor said, what's most important is to find someone or ones who share your values that you can talk to. And in talking together, you can figure out what you do next. So I would encourage you to think in those terms. And I also just want to thank Roland for doing this wonderful, wonderful piece of work.
Merci, Abel.
Susie, you get the last word.
Last word. Thank you. Thank you all for listening, for thinking about this, for engaging on this topic. Thank you so much, Roland, for your work and for working in the community to bring this to the fore, this really big issue. And thank you, Joseph.
Yes, also we have to thank the interpreters, because without the interpreters, we wouldn't have done this. So thank you so much.
Merci. Merci, interpréteur. Merci.
Peace.
Merci tout le monde.